I generally think of myself as a positive person, but today I'm going to start out on a negative note. I want you to think of the worst listener you know. I want you to get a real person in mind. All right? Now that you have this person in your mind, what do they do that makes them such a lousy listener? Do they interrupt you when you're talking? Or do they talk so much themselves that you don't get a chance to say anything? Do they change the subject? Or when you ask them a question, your response is irrelevant to what you're talking about? Are they doing something else while you're talking, like watching TV, trying to read a magazine? Do they give you eye contact? Or are they looking past you even to see if maybe someone more interesting is behind you that they'd rather listen to? Or possibly they just stare at you with a blank expression on their face. Whatever it is that they do that makes them such a lousy listener, how does it make you feel when you think someone is not listening to you? Do you get angry? Are you hurt? Do you feel like you're really unimportant to that person? Generally, there's a strong emotional response from us when we believe someone is not listening to us. And that's the reason I began today's lecture on a negative note, because I wanted to emphasize the importance that listening plays in our lives. Hello, I'm Vicki Kegley Wilson, a communications faculty member at Bluegrass Community and Technical College. Welcome to today's key concept lecture on listening. I will structure the lecture today around 5 components of listening: hearing, attending, understanding, remembering, and responding. I hope to show you as we go over these 5 components that they're not linear at all, not even distinctly separate from one another. Rather, they're rather fluid and overlapping. Let's get started by looking at the first component, hearing. Hearing is the physiological aspect of listening. Hearing is a non-selective process. It's just a matter of sound waves bouncing off your eardrums. So any sound wave that hits your eardrums, you're hearing that sound. Hearing is necessary for listening, but it's important to know that all that we hear, we don't necessarily listen to. And that's where we go to the next component, which is attending. When we start talking about attending, that's what we decide we're going to pay attention to or that we do focus on. When we start talking about attending, I'd like for you to think a minute about what does attending look like physically. You might be saying, well, I give eye contact to the person I'm listening to. If I'm trying to listen and listen well and pay attention, then I usually have a more erect posture. I'm not slouching and lazing around. Also, it's very likely that my posture is leaning forward a bit more, that I'm being attentive to the person by physically looking at them and leaning toward them. Cognitively, what does it feel like when I'm listening? I try to focus my mind on what the person's saying. I may mentally paraphrase what the person's saying to me. Perhaps mentally I'm trying to relate something that I have in common with what the person is saying. Perhaps mentally I'm starting to phrase questions that I could ask this person to help me understand a little better. But my mind stays on the subject that's being shared with me. And I want to emphasize, too, that attending to someone or not attending to someone will impact our perception. In other words, if we don't pick up on certain words that somebody says or certain actions that they present, their behavior, if we don't pick up on certain cues, they will affect our perception process. And if we don't have all the information, then it will increase the possibility that we might misinterpret what that individual is trying to say to us. And so if we misinterpret, now we're going into understanding, which is going to be the next component we look at. If we don't attend and don't attend well, we're not picking up enough cues to interpret the person well, and that can lead to misunderstanding. So now I'd like to talk about the third component, which is understanding. When we talk about understanding, it's more than understanding what the language is or what the words themselves mean. We want to look at the connotation of words, and we want to be able to realize and appreciate, once again, that perception process, that how I perceive the world can be quite different than the way someone else perceives it. So when we consider understanding, when we're talking about the listening process, it's not just what the message means to me as the listener that's important. Probably more important is understanding what the message means to the speaker. That leads to my understanding about what the person's feeling, what the person's thinking. And so we need to be much more sensitive to the cues that we pick up on if we're going to be good at listening and truly understand the individual. One component, too, that I want to talk about in understanding, this is where it gets fluid again. If we go down to the last component I talk about on responding, how you respond to an individual might impact the way you understand what they're saying to you. Such as, if while you are attending to the person, our second component we talked about, and cognitively you are staying focused, and so you're thinking of how it relates to you, and you possibly have a question. If you choose to respond with a question, then you may have better understanding of what the person says. So it's important to realize that one of the components of responding can have a direct impact on your understanding of what the person has to say. Now, if we move on to the next component, which is remembering, I want to emphasize the idea that I think remembering is an important component to look at in listening. I think it's a good way to measure listening, because if we cannot retain what we've heard or listened to, it won't affect us in the future. It will not have an influence on what we say or do next. When we look about remembering, one of the terms that come up is residual message. A residual message is that which you remember when you've forgotten everything else. And as I hinted out earlier, statistics show we're really not very good at remembering the information that we've listened to. As a matter of fact, the statistics that's shared in the interpersonal communication text interplay indicates that we only remember half of what we hear immediately after hearing it. Those statistics are not so good. It gets even worse after 8 hours. After 8 hours, we only remember 35% of what we heard, far less than the half of what we've heard. Now, I do want to emphasize that we generally remember an overall impression of what any speaker might have said to us, but it's the details that we have problems recalling, and those details that we may miss out on can certainly lead to not having a good understanding of the individual, which was the earlier component I talked about. Now I'd like to come to the last component that I wanted to discuss in listening, and that's responding. Up to this point, the four components, hearing, attending, understanding, remembering, were all internal to the listener. Now with the fifth component, with responding, it's external. It allows, it's the response that the listener gives to the speaker. Now what I want to emphasize when we talk about responding is how a listener responds will definitely influence the perception that the speaker has of us as the listener. All right? How I listen will affect the perception that the speaker has of me. Now remember, people can't read our minds. People only know what we tell them, either verbally or non-verbally. All right? So we may be listening to an individual, but if we don't let them know, either verbally or non-verbally, that we're listening, they have no way of knowing whether we're listening or not. They can't read our minds. So if we begin to look a little bit at how we listen will influence the perception of the speaker, let's look at the idea that you choose to really attend well. You're giving eye contact to the individual. You have a facial expression that matches what they're saying. If they're telling you something funny, you're laughing at it, that you're leaning forward. All the cues say that you're listening to that person. Their perception is, hey, you're a good listener. If on the other end, that you're acting like you're not really paying much attention, you're doing something else on the side, maybe looking around, looking at your watch, the perception I have of you as the speaker is that you're bored with me, that you don't find me very interesting. Now what you want to also realize is how you listen will influence the actual behavior of the person that is speaking to you. In other words, if I'm speaking to you and you're acting interested, you're back again, really attending, and I'm telling you a story that happened to me over the weekend, well, I'm likely to go into lots of detail and tell you all the specifics I can because I can tell you're interested. On the other hand, if I'm telling you this story and you act bored and you're looking at your watch, what am I likely to do? I'm likely to wrap it up really quick and not put in much details. As a matter of fact, I might even stop right in the middle of it and not finish the story at all. So indeed, how you listen to someone will affect what they say or do next. All right, as we come to a close today in today's lecture, I want to remind you, I talked about 5 components: hearing, attending, understanding, remembering, and responding. I hope through the short time that I talked about it that you were able to see that they're not linear in nature, they're not necessarily distinct components, but indeed that they're rather fluid and they overlap. I hope also that you could see through the short time today that your listening behavior will have a direct effect on the quality of your interpersonal relationships. Remember how you felt when someone is not listening to you? Or at least you think somebody's not listening to you? Developing good listening skills is one way that you can improve your interactions with others.